Hi, my name is John Small, and I am the producer and host of the Right About Now podcast. You can find out all about me at rightaboutnowmedia.com. I am also an editor at large at entrepreneur.com. And if you look me up, you'll find all my bylines there.
So I do this lightning round at the beginning, 5 questions. When did you first identify as a writer?
I first identified as a writer my senior year of college. I wrote a one-act play the year before, never really thought much about it. I just wrote it for a class that I took a playwriting class at Wesleyan University in Connecticut and kind of put it in the shelf, didn't think it was too good, and was very into acting. And in my senior year I sort of thought I wanted to be an actor, et cetera. And I gave it to a bunch of actors, say, what do you guys think of this thing as a joke? They're like, oh dude, we have to put this on. And suddenly I went from being this like fledgling writer, really more wanting to be an actor, to thinking like, well, maybe writing is a thing for me, because they put on my play. And I still don't think I've ever had more of a thrilling moment than seeing something that you wrote like acted out on stage in front of an audience.
Bet. Yeah.
Kind of incredible. And my parents were there. It was just like a very special time for me, and I think it validated me as a writer, gave me some confidence as a writer. And I still didn't think I wanted to be a writer when I graduated from college. And I was actually a receptionist at this magazine called Child Magazine in New York City. And just answering the phones, it was like an odd job I was doing as I was sort of auditioning for acting roles. And I started to become very friendly with the staff there because I was just like the receptionist. And there was an interview with George Carlin that was available, and nobody could do it. And somehow they got word that I did like to write and that I had written some stuff before. And they said, John, would you like to write this interview with George Carlin? He's going to call in about a
Oh
half
my
hour.
God.
And so I interviewed George Carlin. That was the first writing assignment. And it was just as a receptionist. It was so lucky. I can't believe that happened, and they would trust me with that assignment. But anyway, I wrote this story, and as a result of that story, I got a job as an editorial assistant at Child Magazine, a parenting magazine. I was 22 years old. I knew nothing about children, but that was it. The rest is history.
I love that story. Yeah. So my first interview that I did was with Roxane Gay, and I
Oh, wow. Intimidating.
just, yeah, but it was a similar kind of thing where like I had just figured out that I was kind of wanted to be a writer, and I learned this secret password, which is the word galley. And if you use the word galley, people think you know what you're talking about. And so they just gave me the interview, even though
Like,
I
I
didn't.
saw her galley. Yeah, you were talking about
I
that's
was requesting a galley and I asked for an interview, and they were like, sure. And I didn't even have placement. And then I reversed engineered it, but that's
that is
hilarious.
amazing. And she must have been. It's intimidating interviewing other writers, because that they've especially report, like, she's a journalist, so like interviewing people who kind of do this for a living and
Have
interview
been on
other
the other
people.
side. Yeah.
I'm always a little bit intimidated, but they're always very flattered to be interviewed, and then they're always very complimentary, because I think they know it's hard. It's like when
Yeah.
you're a waiter and you feel sympathy for your waiter,
I'm sure I seemed green, but my copy of Bad Feminist was like dog-eared, and I
Right.
had post-it notes sticking out, and I just remember her being like, "Oh, wow, you prepared for this." So then I was like,
I'm
"Okay, it's
sure you
fine."
got a lot of respect there.
Yeah.
You're a crazy fan, or just yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
What's your all-time favorite book?
This changes, I think, every few years.
Yeah, it's a hard
I
question.
It's a hard question, because it's kind of where you are in your life. And the book that I just kind of blew me away, that I read about 2 years ago, was this book called Lonesome Dove by Larry
Oh,
McMurtry. Do you know this book? This
did
book,
this inspire the show?
it inspired the show that was, I think, on, I think there was some sort of primetime show that
Mhm.
was on in the 80s or the 90s. It's just an unbelievable book. Like, it's one of these books that it takes like 50 pages to kind of get into it. And then once he hooks you, it's like The Wire. This was the same experience I had watching The Wire, where like, it took me a little while to get into it, and then I couldn't stop watching. But this book was the same thing, where I was reading on a family trip to Mexico. I got hooked in like the plane down. And then like I didn't even want to be on the trip anymore with my phone. It was so mean. I was like, I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to find like 10 minutes to read it, like secretly. I just was obsessed with this book. I loved it. I love the characters. I love the way he told the story. And I just never wanted it to end. And so that book has now become my favorite book. And now I'm like, wow, I guess I'm really into Westerns. And now I've tried to pick up all these Westerns. I'm not really that into Westerns. I was just really, really into that book.
What's
Yeah.
the main like plot of
I mean,
Lonesome Dove?
it's the story of a group of kind of vagabond cowboys who are decide to go to, I think it's Idaho. It's like the 1850s or something. No,
So it's
it's a
not
little
even
bit,
like Idaho yet.
yeah, it's not even Idaho yet. So it's like unsettled territory. And they kind of, it's like their journey from Texas to Idaho. And it's just these incredible relationships and characters, and then all this insane stuff that happens to them on the way. And he just has a way of, he tells the story from the third person, but it's always from the perspective of whatever story, one of the characters. And that's so hard to do as a writer, where you're the omniscient narrator, but you're sort of, you keep switching sort of like your focus to the different
Hmm.
characters who are apparently telling the story at that stage of the story. It's really hard to do, but he makes it seem so effortless. And he writes in a very simple but like powerful way. And the characters are just amazing. It's like a real page turner too. So it's like, you just know what's going to happen. What's going to happen. I mean, it's just sort of has everything. I loved it. I love that book.
I love that. I actually do love Westerns, so
Oh,
I feel
really?
like I
Well, I
need
feel like,
to read this.
yeah, tell me some, because I have, since then, I've been looking for Westerns that I might really enjoy. And I have not, I mean, there's a lot of kind of cliche Western type stuff, which is fine. I'll read it. And it's always the same story, like the cowboy comes into town.
I guess, yeah, it's been more TV lately. It's like the
Yeah.
English,
Oh, the English is great.
1883, 1923. I read old shit about the Donner Party all the time.
Yeah. Well, I love historical fiction. So if it's historical fiction, I'm probably going to like it for the most
Yeah.
part. Yeah.
What's your dream writing routine?
Funny question. My dream writing routine is having it be finished and not writing at all and just being like, I'm a novelist. Uh, but I think if I actually have to write, I mean, I have this fantasy. Listen, on my podcast, I've interviewed a lot of people about their rituals and their routines. And I'm always just fascinated that people even have routines, because I don't have one. But if I did have one, it would be that I would, basically exercise in the morning, do some morning pages, probably get a little mindfulness in, then sit down for an hour and a half, 90 minutes, and do some like deep work writing, turn the phones off, have no other responsibilities except for that particular thing I'm writing, then get up and
Mhm.
take a walk and sort of take chill, maybe go to a museum, and then come back and write another 90 minutes. I just learned that this thing called the 90-minute rule from somebody I was interviewing.
Tell us.
It's apparently this amazing technique where she had learned it from Tony Schwartz, who is the guy who wrote Trump's autobiography. Remember that was so controversial, like I forgot
Which
what it was.
one?
The first one he ever wrote, which was like and then him saying like, this guy Tony Schwartz came out when Trump was president and just said that he's, completely unfit to be president, as
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. He
yeah,
wrote the original.
he
Yeah.
wrote the original. So this guy told this woman that I interviewed on a plane to Davos, very fancy, because she was a Wall Street Journal reporter, that he does the 90-minute rule. And the 90-minute rule is you just do very concentrated work for 90 minutes, and then you have to make yourself stop. And you have to get up and recharge and do something completely different and get your mind off of it, and then do another 90 minutes. But he thought that there was something about that 90-minute chunk of devoted time where you're not distracted, where you're not, beating yourself up. You just tell yourself it's 90 minutes. I'm going to do it. And he felt that that was a great way to break out of ruts. And also the recharging is really important, that you can't just be creative all day. You need some time to like be away from your computer, your notepad, whatever you're writing in, and just be alone with your thoughts, or just be inspired by some art somewhere else. So I thought
Yeah.
that was cool. So that would be like my, like, do chunk of 90 minutes, then maybe like by the time it's like 3 or 4 o'clock, be done, and be like, I'm done with my day of writing and I can do the other things I need to do in my day. The reality
Yes. Let's talk about the real
is
writing routine.
is quite different, because so one of the things I'm doing these days is I have a full-time job at entrepreneur.com, and very recently they asked me if I wouldn't mind writing 1 or 2 stories for the website a day, because they're
One
having,
or two a
I
day?
know, but these
Does
are
it hurt
quick.
your brain?
It hurts my
How?
brain and it's very hard, but I've become very good at writing these types of stories because they're only about 500 to 600 words. They're not originally reported. They're sort of taking a look at some of the kind of breaking news of the day and then kind of putting our spin on it, and, referencing all the quotes I get from other people, basically doing like what we call write arounds, right, of existing stories. So I just wrote one about the richest man in the world, who was just named yesterday the richest man in the world, who was this guy. It's not who do you think it is?
wasn't it Elon Musk and he got dethroned?
He got dethroned. So that was the guy I wrote about. This guy Bernard Arnault, who's the head of a company that makes Christian Dior, and he's a French guy. But anyway, so that kind of story is the kind of story that I've been writing lately, where it's kind of like a quick hit, kind of a catchy headline, and then like bit of news, but like some attitude, kind of just like making it not just like a chat GPT story, but like a story that's written by a human being. Anyway, those actually take a lot of effort. But so the kind of writing I've been doing these days is a lot of like, bang, just bang it out, bang it out. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to go get some lunch. I'm going to take a walk, come back, bang it out. There's no method to my madness. And I've always been very jealous of people who have routines and actually can, because the way I write is so haphazard and kind of impulsive. I tend to write better at night. So I like after dinner, between when I have dinner and go upstairs to watch TV with my wife, I like to write like 2 hours during that time. Is that when you
That's
like?
your creative
That seems to
writing
be a very
time.
creative time for me. Not most people say the
But you're
morning.
not working on entrepreneur.com stuff, right? You're
No,
working on your own stuff.
at that point, I'll work on my own stuff, or sometimes I'll work on entrepreneur.com stuff because it's 2 stories a day is a lot.
That is so many. I feel like I want to talk to your boss for you. I want to be
You
like,
should.
hey,
And that's not even my only
that's
job. Like I'm running a
honestly
podcast
inhumane.
network. I don't think he gets. I mean, I've told him like, dude, writing stories. It's not like it takes me a long time. It's not like I figured out a science to it, but it's still brain power and just
Yeah. Thank
trying
God
to.
you don't have to do original reporting, but
No, and I've
still.
done that. That's impossible. And I have done a lot. Obviously, in my career, I've done a ton of original reporting. It's a whole different ball game. So those 2 hours are pretty important for me that I have after dinner and like up until TV time.
Yeah. Fuck your family. You got
I know.
no, I'm just kidding.
They don't care. They're like, my kids are like teenagers by this point. They're just upstairs looking at their phones or talking to their girlfriend. And I'm just like down here. My wife's doing her, everybody's kind of doing their thing right after dinner. So, but we
Yeah.
always have a family dinner. That's important to us.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. What's one piece of writing that makes you jealous you didn't write it?
I was thinking about, because you had asked me this question before our interview, and I've been thinking there's so many things I get jealous of. This is not a quality of mine that I'm particularly proud of. I think the thing that I'm the most jealous of recently is, so I have a friend named Taffy Brodesser Ackner, who is,
Yes. I used
you
to
know
take
her?
classes from her. Yeah.
Okay, you did. That's so funny. So you
Yeah.
and Melissa, our mutual friend Melissa. So Taffy, I used to work for Media Bistro, which was a company that Taffy was sort of overseeing here in Los
Uh-huh.
Angeles before she did like Writing Pad and those other stuff. And I know her so well, and she wasn't really a writer then, and now she's like become this huge writer.
I
And
know.
she wrote Fleischman is in Trouble, which was a book, a great book, and then was a television show. And I have to say, I think it's really, the way she did it is like masterful, and I'm completely jealous of her success. And even though I love her and I've had her on my own podcast twice, it's hard for me because it's so good, and I don't know how she did it. And I wish I was writing television shows like her. And I admire her because she started pretty late in her career, and she
Uh-huh.
really has like reached heights that most of us like never reach. I think all of us that used to work with her or for her are sort of like, they get a little bit jealous. It's just
Okay.
completely unfair. And
I
because she's a
totally
lovely
get
person.
that. But can I tell you, I want to give you another angle on it because
Yeah.
as her student, right before this, she'd like written for Self
Yep. All
and a
those
couple
essays,
other
critical essays.
things, but it was not happening big. She was just kind of starting, I think, at the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
and she was frustrated. Like, I remember being her student and understanding that she was like frustrated. She had gone to school to be a screenwriter. She felt like that was not going to happen, that she
Yeah.
was like doing this other path. I remember specifically her being frustrated by those like 30 under 30 or
Oh, wow.
even for I like whatever those lists are. I remember her being like knowing like the deadline, like she was already past that, and she was great. She was like a very influential teacher for me. But I think of that sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I totally get why she felt like that then, or it seemed like she felt like that. And fuck yeah, that she did everything she thought she wasn't going to do.
That is crazy. By the way, I just realized that part where I said Melissa also, that was not true. Melissa did not take classes with Taffy. It was my cousin Abby who still remembers that class that she took with Taffy.
I wonder if
But
I
I think,
know Abby because I took like 3 of them or whatever
oh,
at that time.
really? If you
Yeah.
remember an Abby Stone, she was a big fan of Taffy's, and it really helped her in her career too. So I know Taffy was a great teacher, but I think you bring up a great point because I think we tend to think that the people we really admire are just like super happy and content. And I think no matter where
Or
you are,
that it's always been how that's been for them.
yes,
It's like
exactly.
that's wasn't how her life. She didn't
It
know
was.
she was gonna write Fleischman
I
Was in
know. And I think
Trouble.
even when Taffy was writing, I would imagine, and sorry, Taffy, we're talking about you if you're app and listening to this, because
Yeah.
I do love you.
You're
You're well admired here. I mean, I like to think, and I don't even know if I'd like to think, I would imagine that even now she has stresses about people that she
Oh,
perceives
for
having,
sure.
having more success than she. And to me, she has reached like the pinnacle of where
Yeah.
I would want to be in my career, right? She's written her own TV show. I mean, the power that she has on her own TV show, she like had her own production company. And it's like incredible where she went from where she was to where she is now. It really, there's not too many parallels.
Yeah. No,
Good
anyway,
lesson for all of our listeners
good
out
lesson. Yes.
there.
Okay. So this is a very interesting fact about you, but you used to be Jake. Tell us
uh,
about this.
so yes, in the 90s and in the early 2000s, I was Jake. Jake is, sometimes people think it's called Ask Jake, but it really is just Jake. And Jake is this fictional character that was created by Glamour magazine to basically it's an advice column where he gives advice to lovelorn women from a male perspective. It seems very, very dated now when I even talk about it, but in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was still pretty cool. I got a job as senior editor of Glamour, I think in 1999. And I asked the editor in chief, Bonnie Fuller, at that time, if I could take over the Jake columns. They had been freelancing it out. And she said, sure. And there was never one Jake. You know, there's been many of us. In fact, I think we should start like a Facebook group or something like the Jake.
Yeah.
Because there's been a lot of us, but it's always in the same voice somewhat. He's kind of like a little bit of a bad boy. And, you know, he's just like, this is the way it is, you know, kind of thing. But he's also got a heart. So they asked me to write Jake, and it was totally my thing for months, where basically they would say, you know, every month we'd have to come up with a topic. And when you work at Glamour magazine, at least when I worked at Glamour magazine, I was one of like 3 men and a staff of about 120 women. So we would sit around this huge conference table and kind of brainstorm ideas, and they would tell me about all their terrible dating things and sort of send me like ideas, and I'd go back to the drawing board, and then I would write these columns about, you know, what was on my mind. I think the first one I wrote, and it's not like these were so innovative.
No, but this was kind of an iconic thing. Like
It was an
people
iconic
knew,
thing.
there wasn't like as much social media or online stuff then. And so these magazines were like big and
They were big. And I will meet women of a certain age who will tell me like, oh my God, I like lived and died by your column when I was, you know,
mm,
16. It makes me feel, it's usually more that like when they were 13, because the little secret of Glamour is, even though it's supposed to be for like 20-year-olds, like really the people who read that magazine are like 15 and 16, and the people who read 17 are actually 12. So it
yeah.
was kind of like, you know, a much younger audience than we pretend that we were catering to. But yeah, I had found this little niche before Jake of writing about women and about dating from a male perspective, because I was also, when I was working at Child Magazine, just as a little callback to my days at Child Magazine, the magazine on the same floor was this magazine called YM. I don't know if you read
Uh-huh.
YM
Of
when you were
course I
a kid.
read YM.
So YM was on the same floor. So here I was, like, by day writing about, you know, parenting tips and best children's books to get your kid. And by night, I, you know, was friends with all the editors at YM, and they'd be like, you should write, we need more guy stuff. So they would give me these assignments, these freelance assignments to like write about, you know, dating, you know, what you can tell about your girl by the kind of salad that she orders, and what, you know, how to know it, does he dig you? No, is he about to break up with you? Like 10 signs. And it was all these kinds of stories. So I had been prepped. Before I got, it wasn't like I just came to the Jake cold. I had actually been writing that kind of a story for a long time, and had sort of carved out this weird niche for myself, and was kind of known as the guy that could do those kinds of stories. And so then when Jake came along, it was kind of like, oh, well, this is a natural progression. Now I have my own column at a famous magazine. And it was awesome. And it lasted until I left Glamour. And I left Glamour fairly quickly because I got a job at a magazine called Stuff Magazine, which was for
Oh
men,
yeah. Yeah.
and
Stuff.
then started writing a different type of story. It's so interesting, the difference between advice that you give guys and the advice you give women. It was like from a different universe. The advice for women was all about how to like form a connection, and, are we friends, and how do I get past the friend zone? And the advice for guys was all like, foreplay
Don't
in less
rape
than,
her. Don't
get through,
rape
yeah,
her.
get how to get through foreplay, quickly. Forget foreplay. Here's how to, how
Oh
to date a
no.
model. And it was awful.
In
So
retrospect, was your advice to either
it,
audience good?
I think it was good. I think that I'm a little bit embarrassed by the stuff I wrote for Stuff, because I feel like it was insensitive. We were very careful actually not to be too over the top misogynistic, but it certainly wasn't like
But that was the
I wasn't.
time. This
Yeah, I
was the
wasn't
Girls
proud of
Gone
it.
Wild time.
Yeah, this was the Girls Gone Wild. We were always very sensitive to not being too like bro, like it was always more funny than real advice, but still, it was not. I'm not proud of it. So I recently looked at the Jake stuff, and there's not too much stuff I would to say differently. I mean, it's just very like cookie cutter. It's just like man and woman cis relationships. Like, right? It's never
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
like stuff that's beyond the kind of classic dating paradigm of that time. And now things are so different. I mean, with polyamory and open relationships and bisexuality, and I mean, my kids' generation, it's just a completely different thing. So, I mean, first of all, I doubt that Jake would be a white male anymore. It would just be too like cliche. I don't know. It's almost too old school.
Well, you know who is a columnist for Cosmo, I think, that I recently interviewed is Zachary Zane, and he is a white guy, but he is bi and goes to sex parties and
Okay.
just wrote a book called Boy Slut.
Nice.
And all of his advice is like poly friendly, bi
Yeah. So
friendly.
he's like more modern. And maybe I would have been that guy in 1999, who knows. But that kind of guy was not as much of a thing. So yes, I definitely have aged out of that particular. But I went with the stages of my life, because right now I'm a dad with two teenagers. So I don't think I'm going to be writing about like sex parties and orgies. And I mean, I would love to be. We just have to get my wife involved somehow.
So wait, okay, so from stuff to entrepreneur.com, bridge that gap for us.
There was a lot of pivoting. I think a lot of people who came up in the 90s as magazine editors, like me, kind of found themselves in the 2000s not really knowing what to do. And so I was a little bit ahead of the curve, not by design, but because I moved to LA after Stuff Magazine to work for a friend's production company in film. It was a very entourage situation where he had this tremendous amount of money that he had gotten for his production company, and we lived in this mansion in Santa Monica. And I was his head of development. I knew nothing about movies, but I was just like a different career and a whole different, thing. And that literally lasted 6 months, and he ran out of money. And it's the only thing that friend has ever done that's been unsuccessful. He's like a multimillionaire now. But it got me out to LA, and I never left LA after that. And I just started finding these odd freelance jobs. This is kind of around the time that I first met Taffy Brodesser-Akner at Media Bistro. I was teaching, I was writing freelance for all the magazines I worked for, Glamour stuff. And then I realized like those magazines, that was sort of like the business was starting to die off. And then I got a job in the .com world. We used to make fun of the .com people when I was in print. Like the .com was like the losers that looked like were like in the basement, office. Like that wasn't the cool job. And then they became the cool ones. And I got a job as heading editorial for this company called Break.com, which was, you'd have to be a guy again of a certain age to remember Break.com. It was like guys falling off of skateboard videos and that kind of thing. It was pre-YouTube, right? It was like a little bit before YouTube, and it was a very popular type of, and so, kind of continued my mail magazine world, and I became the head of editorial. And so we started all these websites under the Break banner.
I love that your job is just essentially curating skateboard.
Yeah, that was basically my job. It was awful. I must be coming across sounding like the most intelligent person here. I actually would read good books at night and try to save my sanity and go to museums and try to remain cultured. So once that was over, I pivoted to video because video was the big thing then, and became a video guy. And then I went to the Game Show Network of all places, and I ran their video department, their online digital video department. So they were making game shows for they hoped for teenagers. This was sort of pre-TikTok. And we were making videos on YouTube and using YouTube stars as like hosts of game shows and stuff like that. So all of a sudden I had this like weird pivot in my career where I was like the video guy, but I never felt very comfortable as the video guy because I was not really raised in video and didn't really have the chops in video. I was really always have been a writer and an editor. So eventually I found my way back to entrepreneur.com. I never thought I would be in publishing, like media publishing again, but they offered me a job, and it was a good timing because I'd just been laid off. The whole department had just been laid off the Game Show Network, and I needed a job. And that's where we are. There's been a lot of pivots in between, and also sort of discovered during this time podcasting.
Yeah, I want to know when that started for you.
That started for me kind of as a marketing exercise of trying to get my name out there as a ghostwriter. And so I had this idea that I would do a podcast sort of about writing and then get people excited about working with me as a ghostwriter because I was doing a bunch of ghostwriting. Then the podcast kind of just took on a life of its own. It just became something else. It was just, It wasn't about ghostwriting at all. It was just about writing. It was about living. It was about great stories. It's the podcast, by the way, is called Write About Now. And as a result of that podcast, I was able to get clients, other people who wanted to make podcasts. They were asking me, how do you make podcasts? I said, well, I can show you if you pay me, And so I started this business on the side where I was making podcasts for people. So I kind of have my own podcast. I run other people's podcasts. SAG-AFTRA is my biggest client. And yeah, and then I do podcasts for Entrepreneur. So it's kind of like, I think one of the things I've realized as a writer, you have to have a lot of streams of income these days. There has to be a lot of different things you're doing, unless you're like Taffy Brodesser Ackner and you're able to kind of do one thing. But it helps to have
but
everything.
Even on the way to becoming Taffy Brodesser Ackner,
oh, she had a
you
lot of
have
odd
to
jobs.
have a lot of jobs.
For sure. She had a lot of odd jobs. I mean, running Media Bistro, and I guess you probably worked with her. Was it at Writing Pad? I know she was there for a
Yeah,
while.
Writing Pad.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think that, I mean, teaching, I always have loved teaching and would love to go back to teaching. There's no, everybody was like, well, how do you break in? And it's so different, obviously when I was younger, sound like an old man here, but it was a little bit of a different path. Like, I think there's a lot of new ways to break in. I have a Substack. I think you have a Substack too, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like, I'm trying to explore all these different avenues of getting my work out there. And it helps to have Entrepreneur because that's a legitimate platform that has a lot of traffic and kind of legitimizes me in a way. It legitimizes, it's easier to pick up the phone and say that I'm with Entrepreneur than just I'm by myself. But, I think that only goes so far. And I think, I like my job a lot at Entrepreneur. It's a magazine about being an entrepreneur. And so I like to sort of flex my entrepreneurial muscles because that's all I'm thinking about all day is how to be an entrepreneur. And so it's a funny situation where I'm working full time for a magazine and talking about being an entrepreneur. So I'm like sort of a fake entrepreneur. I'm a half entrepreneur.
Well, no, but you sort of are with your podcast business, right?
I am. And I'll be a full-time entrepreneur when that's the only thing I do. But right now I'm still hanging on. And I think, if you have the ability to be able to do both, I think it's probably the better track. It's certainly for your peace of mind.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, if you can do both.
Have you, throughout your time as a writer, noodled on any book-length writing projects?
Yes, I have many times started books and not finished them. I'm very bad at doing things when I don't have an assignment and don't have a deadline.
Me too.
And I'm mad at myself because I know this about myself and I've known this about myself for years and still I don't do it. And I get, there's a million projects that I've started and haven't finished because something else took priority. Right now I'm working on a project. It's in the outline stage, honestly, but it's sort of inspired by colleagues of mine who have written kind of like thought leader type books about whatever their interest is. And some of them have been published by legitimate, mainstream publishers, and some have been self-published. But I think I realize the power of having a book as part of your repertoire can sort of open up avenues for you that might not be normally opened up. Like, maybe like, for example, appearing on many more different podcasts, even speaking to like groups of, I remember when I was at the Game Show Network, we would have these conferences in like Florida, and they would fly in these experts, right, to talk to us about different topics. We had one guy talk to us about language, and I actually just had that guy on my podcast because he's like a language expert, and it was really interesting to hear his insight. But he is a language expert. He's considered a language expert because he's got a few books on it, and it just legitimizes him in a way that even though so that is my project. I won't get too into the details, but it's going to be about writing about storytelling in all that I've learned about that topic and sort of distilled in my way. And I'm considering just self-publishing it because 5 years ago, if you had asked me if I would self-publish, I'd be like, no way. I'm snotty about it. But I'm not that way anymore because I see that it's a different economy now, and that's just ego. And honestly, it's much faster and cleaner way to get your work out there. It really depends.
And you already have like, somewhat of a platform to go out to. So it's not like you're just like putting it out there and there's nothing. Yes,
you have your own pod. Like you and I both have a podcast, and so we have an audience built in. Yeah, so I think it just helps focus a little bit who I am. Like even doing this interview, you would probably, the Jake stuff is super interesting, but you would have a little bit more to talk to me about because I would have had a certain thing that is like my thing that I'm promoting at that point. Yeah, so that's kind of my project. And then I guess my dream project, I do really want to write a novel before this life ends, because I love reading novels, and my whole life, I've always wanted to write a novel. And again, it's one of those things that just always takes a backseat to writing about the world's richest man or whatever, story I'm working on.
That motherfucker.
That son of a bitch, $200 billion. Can you imagine? It's so insane. So yeah, so a novel is my dream project.
So can I say I have the same thing where like I need a dominatrix basically to
For sure.
write all my goals. Even though I am very passionate about telling the stories and I'm like always thinking about just to like get the project done because I'm the type of person that likes to juggle like 10 things like an idiot. I need a taskmaster. And
Yeah.
so
At
what
least we think we do.
well, I think I could try to quote unquote fix my personality or whatever
Yeah.
and in a very uncomfortable way, or I can just take writing classes
Yeah. And
and
make yourself, right?
yeah, and
Be accountable.
pay someone to like, make me. And so what I've been doing is I think I told you about this when we had our little meetup, but
Yeah.
yeah, I've been taking Chloe Caldwell's 12-month memoir generator, and it's just so helpful to just feel like
Great.
I owe people and
Hey,
myself working on the project every week. I think
that's
that's
so
why
great.
people do MFAs.
I think so too. I think it just makes you do it. I mean, I did do this. I took a writing class at UCLA. It was called the 10-week novel. And I love the teacher. It was in an in-person class, which was kind of fun because like that was back pre-COVID. I don't even know if they do these kinds of classes anymore, where we would all show up, and like with our work. And I did write a novel in 10 weeks. It wasn't a very good novel, but to just sit around and like it made me do it. And I would be so stressed and be like, why have I done this to myself? Like, what the hell was wrong with me? And I wrote this novel. And honestly, I was looking at the novel recently and I was like, this isn't so bad. I could probably make this work.
You
But
wrote a whole novel?
I wrote a whole novel in 10
That's
weeks.
great.
Yeah, but it wasn't very good because 10 weeks to write something is not going to be, even my teacher said, like, this is not going to be like a
Oh, you
finished,
have to
like,
revise the
yeah,
shit
you
out
have
of
to
it.
revise the shit out of it. But it was a pretty good idea. And I think that, yeah, I think that I'd like to revisit that. I actually it was a young adult novel. So my daughter, who is a huge voracious reader, who's 13 now, I gave it to her the first chapter and she read, she goes, Dad, I love this. You got to keep going with this. So that was very inspirational to me, like, because she's the kind of like the demo. Um,
Nice.
yeah, so it was cute.
Okay,
But
well, I feel like maybe dust off that novel, but
I know.
so is the novel your bucket list writing goals? Do you have
For
any others?
sure. I think I'm done with the screenplay television show idea. I mean, I think many writers, especially when you live in LA, have that fantasy.
Mhm.
I think I might be over that, especially the movie, because I don't think movies are a thing anymore. No, I'd love to adapt whatever I write into a television show. Would be fantastic. But I also know my expertise and my limitations, and I don't want to. People have been doing that for years. That's why I was so impressed by Taffy to be able to kind of make that jump from a novelist to a TV writer. Yeah, no, I think a novel is it. I would love to run my own. I would love to make a podcast, a narrative podcast. I think that's on my bucket list. It's just
Mhm.
something, I do Q&A format. That's pretty much my bread and butter, but I actually listen to a lot of narrative podcasts and I've produced somewhat in my own podcast. I've tried to do a few that were more narrative with like sound design and stuff. I really love doing all that. I was a DJ when I was younger. So I'm very into sound and music and production. And so that's so fun for me. I would be excited to do that. So I listen to some of these true crime or whatever narrative podcasts and I get very excited and think I would love to do that someday.
Nice. Well, I think you definitely can. What's one piece of writing advice you wish you could give your former self?
Don't be so scared. I mean, I think I spent so much time thinking that I wasn't good enough, thinking that I didn't have a good enough idea, thinking that I had to write the great American novel on my first try. And I spent my whole 20s just kind of like psyching myself out of doing something, and 30s and actually 40s. Basically just psyching myself out, always thinking, and I still have this thought pattern that comes in and it must be very familiar to other writers of just being like, your idea is not good enough. Like, oh, that's not your passion. Oh God, this is hard. And, this really you're going to write for 6 months and not be paid. Like, what kind of like you can't afford to do. I mean, I just have I'm very good at talking myself out of stuff. I'm very good at getting excited about ideas at first. And then when it starts really getting into the thick of it, just talking myself out of it. And so my advice would be finish what you start and don't be so afraid what people think, because honestly, it's going to be a lot better than what you think it's going to be. You can't figure it out in your head. You need to put it on the page. You need to
Totally.
actually do it. I try to figure so much out in my head And you can't. There's not enough space in your head to make everything work. You've got to put it on the page. So that would
And
be
you
it.
can edit it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then later you can edit it.
What is one tip for writers trying to get a book published?
Well, I think it really depends. You have to know what you want out of that book. When I would ghostwrite, I would say to my clients, what is your goal here? And it wasn't to be crafty. It was more like if you want to write a book because you feel like you have a great American novel to tell, then tell that story. But if you're writing a book, for example, like we just talked about, for me, as a sort of like showcase for your other talents and sort of an entryway to booking speaking gigs and stuff, then that's a whole different type of goal. And so kind of know what your goal is before going in. Know that the traditional route is not, it's so difficult to break in that way, in a way that might have nothing to do with you personally and your writing skill. It has something to do with maybe the size of your social media following at that time, or whatever it is. There's a lot
Mhm.
of reasons you're not going to get a book deal, and very little of them have to do with your actual ability to write. As I found out very recently, I had a big proposal out. I had an agent, a really good agent, and we had a proposal that I thought was like a winning book idea. And I can even tell you what it was. It was called Anxiety Attack. And it was me for a year trying all these different techniques to tame my anxiety, because I have anxiety, if you hadn't noticed. And so like doing everything from taking like psilocybin mushrooms to doing, like Wim Hof breath exercises. I was like going to go all over the world and try all these different techniques and then kind of report back about what happened and measure my anxiety from when I started to when I ended it. And it was a fun idea that like everybody was excited about. It got me an agent, and I wrote a very detailed proposal and many chapters. And it was like, it took me like almost 8 months to get it all together. And then we went out with it and like didn't get a deal. And like I was so sure we were going to get a book deal. It never even occurred to me that this
I'm
might not happen.
surprised.
I know.
Yeah.
I was a bit surprised. And what I learned, I think, is that you just never know. I mean, there was never any, I mean, maybe people were being very nice, but everybody to an agent said, we love the writing. It's fun. He has a great voice. It's just, we don't think we can sell this book, or we think there's too many books on anxiety out there. And then, some people were honest enough to say, like, we don't think John has a big enough platform to be able to sell this book, like in a big way. So like if I had, 100,000 Instagram followers, it might be a little bit different. So, I think
That
there's just things,
sucks.
yeah, I think there's just things to know. And again, it's not that I would ever not try to do it, but I just learned that it doesn't always have to do with your writing. So, don't be so discouraged. Now, I didn't write a novel. I think it's very different if you write a novel, because that's not really about, I mean, yes, it helps to have 100,000 Instagram followers and a huge TikTok, et cetera. But my understanding is that a good novel will hopefully break through the clutter.
Yeah.
But again, you might not know what they're looking for, and it might not be the kinds of thing they're looking for. Or it might just be like, this is not the year that they're doing this kind of novel.
I like the takeaway from earlier too about just like reconsidering self-publishing. I think like 10, 15 years ago, it like had a totally different connotations than it does today. And it can be a really good way to get yourself out there, especially the first time.
I agree. I don't see why you wouldn't do it anymore. It's also just economically, just a kind of a little bit more of a realistic way. I mean, if that anxiety book had been accepted, it'd taken me a year to write it, and then it would have probably taken them at least a year and a half to get it ready. So it would have been like 3 years from now
Hmm.
that I would have seen any return from that experience. In retrospect, maybe I should have thought about self-publishing. I think it would have just been a little bit too expensive for me to do that,
Ambitious. Yeah.
ambitious to be that on my own. So I kind of needed a little bit of a cushion provided by money up front from the publisher. But you're very right. Like I'm very bullish about self-publishing. I'm excited to do it myself because I've told people they should do it, but I haven't done it. Have you done it?
No, I mean, no, just like through Substack in a way, I feel like
Yeah.
is like a kind of a form of it. And just people, it seems like are rethinking that. And like, I don't want to put all my best shit on the internet where just any old idiot can Google,
Yep.
like I write deeply personal memoir.
Yeah.
I don't
Very.
necessarily want everybody to just Google my shit, like I wanted there to be a barrier where you pay money and decide you want to engage with my work like that. And then I think you'll be a better reader. So,
I agree. And I do think there's too much given away for free on the internet. And I think we tend to, I tend to do this. It's like I would never write for Entrepreneur for free. I don't know why it's okay for me to write for myself for free. I don't know why I set a different standard for my own self than I set for my clients. Like it doesn't make any sense. Like you put a value in your own writing and your own work, you know?
Yeah. What's your all-time favorite piece of your own writing?
Definitely that play, that one act play I told you about, which was called Asleep. I love that play just because it was the first time I had ever done anything like that. And then my favorite experience writing that I ever had, it lasted for a long time. And in a way, it was kind of like writing a novel. I had an assignment from Redbook magazine and it was called Diary of He. And this is like maybe mid 2000s, like where basically blogs were still very popular. And they put out every week, they put out this thing called the Diary of He. And I would write this fictional diary from the standpoint of like a bad boy guy living in New York and dating. And it was this ongoing story, but it was written in diary format. It was like a sort of Sex in the City type, and Sex in the City was popular at this time. So it was kind of like a Sex in the City from a guy's perspective. And it went on for years. So it was like this weird character, that alter ego that I had created. And each week I had to kind of put him in some other new scenario of like falling in love and like falling out of love. And when I first started writing it, it was like all based on my own experience, just dating in my own life. But then I ran out of stories from my own life and it started getting really out there. And when I moved to LA, he moved to LA, but his name was Zach. And like, it's funny because I think you said the guy, his name's Zach, who's at Cosmo now. Was that his name? Anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he was like this total douchebag, so different than I am, but kind of like a weird like fantasy of what I could be if I was just a little bit like tougher and harsher. And but again, he was a fun character because I gave him a lot of layers and he was actually very, very insecure and he had a terrible family life. And you sort of understood after a while why he was the way he was. But it was really like basically like writing a novel. It's just a novel with no end. It had a middle that went on forever. And then finally they gave me like a 4-week warning that it was going to be that they were going to get rid of it. And then so I had to wrap it up and he, obviously falls in love in the end. And who knows if if he ended up lasting in that relationship. And then I tried to sell that idea when I moved to LA. And I had that classic LA meeting where I was in the room and it was an Oxygen Network. And they were like, we want it. We're going to take it off the market today. Congratulations. I was like, oh my God. And then they never called back. That was the end.
Oh my God. I
Yeah.
thought you were going to say Redbook called and they were like, what are you
No.
doing?
Well, that was a whole other thing. So that was a whole other thing where there was always the weird, murky rights situation. And yeah, I still don't know. I've thought about resurrecting that thing, but I think Redbook completely or Hearst, which owns Redbook, completely
I was
owns.
going to say, though, you could probably like work out a deal with them because it
I
does sound
know, but again, it's
interesting.
dated now. Like it's so funny because dating's really changed. So like that was kind of a different time. I mean, it could be set in that time. People love the 90s. It wasn't really quite the 90s, but people love that. So who knows? I've thought about it.
I think, what about like the parallel now? Zach's older and he's going through his first divorce.
It's first and first.
And
It's
he's
true. I would love
dating
to do a
again.
diary of. You're right. I would love to do a follow up. It had like a fan club. Like and it's so sad because Redbook took it down. I was looking for it, and it's not even on the website anymore. I mean, luckily I saved every chapter and I have it all in a book somewhere. But they took it down for whatever reason, and so you can't find it. I mean, you type up Diary Fee, and there's no more Diary Fee up there. So
I mean, if you just came up with your own character, Zach, who's older, I think you could totally get away
it's
with
true.
it.
It's true, and I could just like maybe I would find the old readers. If anybody's listening to this that used to read Diary Feed, there was a lot of you apparently. I didn't have access to the analytics, but we would do Ask Them Anythings, and people would write to me as if I was Zach. Like they'd be like, why did you dump blah blah blah? And I'm like, this is insane. This is like a character that I made up. There are real people. And they get so mad. They would be so mad at me because I was such a jerk. Anyway, I don't know what it is about women, but a lot of women like to know about why men are so terrible, or like, why, like that fascination with bad boys. That was definitely something that I worked a lot in, where I had to deal with a lot in my career.
Well, I feel like that was a thing of that time too.
Maybe the taming the bad boy kind of thing.
Because I'm not interested in bad boys anymore. I'm interested in financially secure men.
It's also an age thing. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think yes, exactly. Bad boys are just trouble in every way. Maybe if a bad boy has some money.
Like my partner's sober, like we're good.
That's awesome.
Okay, so this has been a blast,
You're
per
the best.
usual.
Thank you.
But you mentioned your podcast, and definitely give another plug for that and let listeners know how they can connect with you
Sure.
online.
So I would love people to listen to my podcast. I think if they love your podcast, which is so good, by the way, they
Thank
should
you.
listen to mine. It's called Right About Now, WRITE. And you can find me at rightaboutnowmedia.com. But I'm also on all the socials, Right About Now, on Instagram and Facebook, and not on TikTok yet. YouTube. I post my videos on YouTube. And I have a Substack, which is called Small Talk. And that we
Hi.
talk, yeah, we talk a lot about small talk talks a lot about sort of how to, the challenges we face as writers and how to overcome them. And now that I'm about to embark on this journey of writing a self-published book, I'm sure that I'll be talking a lot about that because it seems to be something that people are interested in.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to read about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney.